What's going on, everybody? On today's project, we're going to take this basic shed subfloor and we're going to spice it up, turning it into this. This video is going to be pretty detailed. It'll show you how to fill the gaps in between the plywood, how to mix up and apply the flexible primer, how to saturate the pigments and apply your epoxy top coat, and finally, how to apply polyurethane for a durable finish that's going to last a long time. So if you need to skip around, use the chapter markers at the bottom of the video, but without wasting any more time, let's get going. So here's a quick look at the shed's plywood subfloor before we did any work to it. So as you can see, it's a little bit dirty, it's very unimpressive, and it's very common for what you'd expect to see in a shed. So the first thing I did here is I just swept up all the dirt and debris and made sure that there was going to be nothing that was going to impact the application of our epoxy later. Next up, you want to make sure that you don't have any screws or nails that are sticking up that are going to impact the application of epoxy. So use a putty knife to see if anything is protruding up, and if it is, go ahead and use a drill or a hammer to make sure that you sink it below the plywood subfloor deck. Repeat this process over the whole shed plywood subfloor area. Finally, I grabbed the vacuum and I vacuumed the entire shed subfloor. Now, although I'm applying an epoxy floor coating in the 10x10 shed you're seeing now, you can apply this for any plywood subfloor, whether that be in a bathroom, in a home, in a basement, any of it. But while we're on the subject, if you want to learn how to build this shed from start to finish, you can check out my links in the description. After preparing your plywood subfloor, the next step is to pick the right epoxy flooring system for your application area. There are a bunch of different epoxy flooring manufacturers out there. Some of the big ones are Spartan Epoxies, Ligari, Rust-Oleum makes some, I think. But basically, spend some time researching what manufacturer is going to be best for you. I went with Spartan Epoxies, and honestly, they were phenomenal to deal with, and the product was spot on. All of the Spartan Epoxy products I used are linked in the video description. Next up, you need to decide on what epoxy flooring look you're going for. There are two main epoxy styles. One is a metallic look, and the other is the flake look. For my epoxy flooring, I went with the metallic system, #flake-free, but the steps to apply the epoxy is pretty similar for both styles. Now, the first step in actually applying the epoxy to your shed subfloor is to apply a crack filler product to all of the gaps in the plywood subfloor. You're also going to fill in the screw heads. So right here, I'm taking the part A of the CF100 product from Spartan Epoxies, and I'm putting that in a mixing bucket. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take the part B component and you're going to mix equal parts A and B in that mixing bucket. And I'm using literally just a paint stirrer to combine that and mix it all together. You want to make sure that you add the right ratio according to the manufacturer's instructions, and you also want to mix this crack filler up according to the manufacturer's instructions. Now, once you've mixed the part A and part B of the CF100 crack repair product together, it'll be kind of this putty. And you're going to take a putty knife and you're going to apply that product to every joint in between the pieces of plywood subfloor and also on top of the screw heads. Let's start by filling in the joints between the plywood, and then we'll go back and do the screw heads. So as you can see, I'm taking the putty knife and I'm filling in the gaps between the pieces of plywood subfloor. If you have large gaps, you're going to obviously need more of the crack filler product to actually fill that in. But in my case here, the gaps weren't too major, so usually one pass was enough to fill that gap completely. As you can see, I'm being pretty liberal with the first pass just to make sure that I get enough crack filler to actually fill that gap. And then I'm going back later on and I'm wiping off all the excess. Now, this doesn't need to be perfect. The big takeaway is that you don't want to have big globs that are sticking up and drying. So try to make sure that you have it pretty flush with the plywood. I also went back and I applied crack filler to any large knots in the wood and then also above any screw holes. So take a few minutes to apply the crack filler product to all of the seams between plywood and also to cover all of the large knots and screw heads. You want to try to seal up all the screw heads and the voids and the gaps between the plywood now, so it doesn't introduce issues when you go to apply the epoxy later. So here's a quick look at the crack filler after it dried. And once we were okay with how everything looked, I applied some painter's tape to the bottom of the wall around the entire perimeter of the shed. The idea here is this will prevent any epoxy coating from getting on the shed walls when we move on to the subsequent steps. I think it's well worth the time to take care of this right now. After applying painter's tape to the perimeter of the shed walls, the next step is to apply our first coating of epoxy. In this case, it's the flexible epoxy primer, which in this case is the Flex System by Spartan Epoxies. So to apply this, we're going to mix it up and then we're going to apply it to the subfloor using an 8 to 12 WFT mil notched squeegee. and then we'll apply it with a 3/16 inch nap roller. You're also going to want some gunite shoes, which will allow you to walk across the epoxy without messing it up. They'll also give you a leg up in your next street fight. So just like most epoxy products, we're going to mix the part A and part B in equal parts in a 5-gallon bucket using the mixer attachment on our drill. Now for substrates like plywood, it's often a good idea to apply a flexible primer like Flex, because these wood subfloors will experience a lot more elongation and warpage and shrinkage over time, and you want to apply kind of a rubberized coating that will stretch and contract and shrink with the elongation and the shrinkage and expansion with that plywood. So this is basically like a rubberized coating which is going to flex along with the plywood. So mix up the part A and part B of the Flex product within the bucket according to the manufacturer's instructions. And a pro tip is to keep the mixer submerged the entire time while you mix. This will prevent air from getting in and creating bubbles in the Flex product. Then what I did is I took my 5-gallon bucket of mixed Flex product and I spread it out all over the plywood subfloor with my notched squeegee. You're just going to push it back and forth, make sure you get it in all the corners, and you can use a paintbrush to get in the hard to reach places like the inside corners of the back wall there. So continue to spread out the Flex epoxy product over the entire shed's plywood subfloor. This process is pretty fun. I recommend that you actually start in the back of the shed and work your way out. That way you don't need to put on the gunite shoes or cleats that will allow you to actually walk on top of the surface. Continue to apply the Flex product as needed until you've covered the entire shed's subfloor area. Be careful that you don't get too reckless and get it on the walls or on the shed ramp, and make sure you stay within the bounds of your taped off area. So after using the notch squeegee and notching out the Flex across the entire shed subfloor, it's time to put on those gunite shoes or cleats, take your 3/16 inch nap roller, and now you're going to go back and you're going to roll the entire area to get a nice uniform layer of Flex product across the entire shed subfloor. Again, I started in the back and I worked my way out. After rolling the Flex product, allow it to dry according to the manufacturer's instructions. In my case, this was about 24 hours. Here's a look at the product after it dried. So after applying Flex, the next step is to apply a Waterborne epoxy primer. For the Spartan epoxy system, this is the HDWB product. And again, you're going to mix part A with part B in a mixing bucket. And this time I just used a hand mixer, just a painting mixer stick, to mix that up. And something I want to note is that this primer is typically the first step if you're applying epoxy on, a concrete subfloor like a garage, but because we're doing ours on subfloor, this step was preceded by the Flex application, since that's going to give us more elongation. So after mixing up this Waterborne epoxy primer, we're going to take a 3/8 inch nap roller, and as you can see, I brought out the big guy for this, and we're going to roll this primer all over the Flex product. So as you can see here, I'm simply rolling the primer over the Flex product that we applied previously. There's no real rocket science here. It's just a matter of getting the primer applied to the entire floor area. So as you can see, I went back and forth. I tried to get as close to the corners as I could with the roller, but you're not going to be able to get all the way into the inside of the corner. You can get close, but you're going to need to do some touch-up work over there. You may need to use a paintbrush to get inside the corners, and as you can see here, I'm going in the inside corners, and I'm also going to go around the roll-up door and the front of the shed near the ramp to make sure that we apply this epoxy primer over the entire surface of the floor. So after using a paintbrush to reach all the hard to reach places on the inside corners and around the roll-up door, I took my nap roller and I completed the application of the primer over the rest of the application area. After finishing up, I closed the roll-up door to prevent anything from blowing in and disturbing the application. Now, while we wait for the epoxy primer to dry, we're going to go ahead and mix up our metallic epoxy pigments and allow them to saturate in the epoxy overnight. Okay, so to install this, what we're going to do, we have a 3-gallon kit right here, and then we have a 1-gallon kit right here. The general rule of thumb is 4 ounces of pigment. This is a 4 ounce right here per gallon of part A. So we're going to take 4 ounces and 8 ounces of this for 12 ounces to go into our part A here. This is going to give us kind of a white base coat. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put about 4 ounces of this Dolphin in the smaller 1-gallon can. So we'll mix all that up and go from there. You can either mix with your mixer right here, or what we're gonna do is just mix this up with these sticks. Let's get into it. So this is the Clear 100 Epoxy Part A that we're gonna mix our pigments into. So we're gonna open that up. That's 3 gallons right there. Here's what we're looking at, just completely plain. Now we'll go ahead and add our pigments. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and put 8 ounces of this great white pigment into the Part A epoxy, and then we're gonna put in an additional 4 ounces of pearl. Now you can see here that I have a shop vac close by, and the idea is that the shop vac will suck up any of the pigment powder that ends up escaping instead of it going up in my face and me potentially breathing it in. And I'm also wearing a respirator right now for protection as well. So continue to mix in all the pigments. You want to mix until it's completely homogeneous and there's no streaks in it. So this can take a few minutes, but we eventually got there. So once your Clear 100 Part A epoxy has no more streaks in it and the pigment is fully dissolved throughout, you're going to go ahead and close it up and let it sit overnight until we actually mix it with the Part B. So seal that up, and now we'll move on and actually mix up our darker pigment. So here is just 1 gallon, so we're going to open that up. This is again the Clear 100 Part A, and we're going to mix in 4 ounces of pigment. We're going to do 3 ounces of dolphin and about 1 ounce of manatee. So as you can see, just as before, we're taking the pigments and we're gonna apply it to the Part A, and we're gonna slowly stir it in before we add all 4 ounces. So I stirred in about 2 ounces, stirred it up for a minute, and then I stirred in the remaining 2 ounces to give us 4 ounces total dissolved in the 1 gallon of the Part A Clear 100. Once this was done, we sealed this back up just like we did for the 3 gallon bucket, and we're gonna give it around 12 hours for the pigments to saturate overnight. Okay, so it's the next day. We have our Part A that we pre-mixed, our Part B that we're gonna mix in, and then for the smaller one, we have our Part A and our Part B. Again, this is kind of the darker metallic, and this is a lighter white. So we'll mix it up. So at this point, we're going to take our Part A and our Part B for both the larger 3 gallon and the smaller 1 gallon Clear 100 Part A's, and then we're going to mix it together. So here we are opening up the 3 gallon and opening up the 1 gallon of Part B, and then we're mixing it together with the mixer attachment for my drill. You're going to mix this according to the manufacturer's instructions. You can see that I gradually poured all the Part B in just to make sure that I got a thorough mix. And you're going to mix this up again for the duration specified by the epoxy manufacturer. Again, you want to keep the mixer submerged during the entire mixing process to avoid air entrainment into the mixture. This is going to prevent you from having a bunch of air bubbles when you go to apply this epoxy later. So after mixing up the 3 gallons of the lighter epoxy, I moved on to the 1 gallon of the darker epoxy. So as you can see, I'm mixing the Part B with the Part A right there, and we're gonna mix it up with the mixer attachment on my drill the same way we did for the 3 gallon. So mix this up according to the manufacturer's instructions, and once we finish mixing, we can start the application process. Now, there are a ton of different ways to actually apply epoxy depending on the look you're going for. In my case, I took my 3 gallons of the lighter pigment epoxy mixture and I dumped it all over the floor. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called a slick coat, which is where I'm going to apply one continuous coat across the entire application area. So as you can see, I'm using a flat squeegee to spread that epoxy around in a thin, uniform layer across the entire application area on my shed's floor. And as you can see, I'm wearing those gunite shoes so I can walk freely across the entire floor area without worrying about where I step. And then I'm just going back and forth, applying a slick coat of the lighter epoxy to the entire application area. It took a little bit of precision to get around the roll-up door and in the corners there, but with enough patience, I was able to get a nice thin uniform coat across the entire area. After thoroughly spreading out the slick coat with the squeegee, I took a 3/8 inch nap roller and I rolled the entire application area to give myself a nice uniform slick coat across the entire floor. I used a 9-inch roller to get on the inside corners and those hard to reach places against the wall, and I used an 18-inch roller for the middle of the shed just to make things go faster. This rolling process is going to make sure that you have a uniform layer across the entire epoxy application area. Continue to roll the slick coat of epoxy until you have a nice uniform layer throughout. After applying your slick coat, you're gonna apply your accent epoxy. In this case, this is the darker metallic epoxy, and we're gonna apply this in small puddles or ribbons across the floor. So continue to apply the accent color. In our case, this is the metallic silver, and I recommend that you continue to pour small ribbons and don't overdo it. Less is more to start, and you can always add more later. After applying enough of this accent epoxy for my liking, what I did is I grabbed a 9-inch roller, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically just swirl the accent color into the slick coat. And this is going to give us a nice kind of metallic look that's blended together, which in my opinion looks pretty cool. Continue to blend in the accent color of epoxy with the slick coat, and you can basically just blend in this circular motion that you're seeing now. And what you can do is you can dip the roller in the dark accent color and then move it to an area that didn't receive any accent color to give you kind of a blended color. The more that you blend and the more that you swirl, the more the two colors will mix together, creating one uniform color. So less is more if you want to have distinct color differences, and if you want it to be more blended, obviously continue to swirl like crazy. Now I'm going to let the time lapse roll out of me actually swirling in the accent color into the slick coat. And I want to note that there really are countless design styles and ways that you can apply epoxy to get specific looks. Because of the look I was going for, it made sense to do that lighter slick coat and then blend in the darker accent epoxy in this swirling method with a roller. However, if you're going for a different look, spend some time on the internet. There's so many tutorials out there that will show you the exact epoxy application and installation procedure to get the look that you're going for. So here I am doing the final touches. I'm swirling in the last few segments of the accent color, and now I'm just cleaning up around the perimeter near the door. So here's a quick look at the shed floor immediately after I finished swirling in the accent color. Now I'm just going to let it cure overnight. Now what I'm showing here is there were a few air bubbles that formed near the front entrance of the shed, and to get rid of those I used a blowtorch and I brought the heat within a reasonable distance to those air bubbles, causing them to pop. You can achieve a similar result with a heat gun. Now here's a quick look at the epoxy floor 48 hours after applying our epoxy. Now, at this point, you technically could be done with your project. However, I wanted to apply a protective urethane top coat just to make sure that this epoxy coating was going to last for a long time. Now, if I would have installed this top coat within 12 hours of applying the epoxy, I wouldn't have had to go back and sand this entire area with a 120 grit sanding screen. But because I waited too long, I had to go back and rough up the surface in order to ensure that the HPU top coat of urethane that I'm going to apply next would adhere properly to the epoxy coat beneath. Then I went back and I vacuumed up all of the sanding dust that I created. Now, just like all the rest of the products, this is a Part A, Part B system, so I'm opening up the Part A's right there, and then I'm going to mix in the Part B's as you're seeing. Once I mix the Part B into the Part A, I'm going to go with my mixing stirrer and mix up the product in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Then we're going to transfer the urethane top coat to a paint tray, and then we're going to apply it to the entire shed floor using a nap roller. In this case, we're using a 9-inch roller with a 3/8 inch nap, and we're just going to roll this urethane top coat across the entire application area. You may find that a paintbrush is useful in cutting in the inside corners if you can't reach those hard to reach places with a roller, but at this point it's simply a matter of getting full coverage of the HPU urethane top coat product over the entire floor. I will note that this stuff is pretty potent. It smells impressive. So you want to make sure that you have windows open. I would recommend that you wear a respirator when applying this product and keep the windows open and the door open for, I would say, 12 to 24 hours after you apply this product to get all those fumes out. So here I am continuing to roll and working my way out of the shed, and I'm doing the final coat right there on the shed entrance. After applying the HPU coat, I closed the door and I allowed it to dry. The next day I came in and I removed that strip of painter's tape around the perimeter. I found that using a utility knife to score along the epoxy surface made it easier to remove, since part of the painter's tape actually got embedded beneath the epoxy. So as you can see there, I'm just scoring that line and then peeling the tape off. So continue to remove the tape around the entire shed perimeter. Now at this point, you've successfully applied epoxy to a plywood subfloor. Let's take a quick reminder look at what this floor used to look like. And now here's a look at the final result. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you like DIY content like this. In the next video, I'm going to show you exactly how much it costs to build this 10x10 shed. I hope to see you there. Thanks for the support, and I will catch you on the next one.